Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 12th episode of Dishin With Democracy. This podcast is focused on discussing civic engagement-related topics, with this particular episode focusing on a discussion of voter accessibility and disability rights. We're hoping to highlight the significance of addressing this often overlooked aspect of civic engagement, as well as hear perspectives on why voter accessibility for disabled individuals needs to be discussed more and the importance of acknowledging it as an important issue. My name is Leslie Cruz. I'm a senior psychology and sociology major on the pre-law track and one of the undergraduate coordinators here at the Center for Civic Justice.
Hello, my name is Anna. I am a sophomore majoring in political science with a second major in global studies and international relations, and I am currently an intern at CCJ.
Hi, my name is Kelly. I'm a senior majoring in sociology, and I'm currently an intern here at CCJ.
Hi, my name is Sasmia. I'm a sophomore majoring in political science with a minor in globalization and international relations. I'm also on the pre-law track, and I'm an intern here at CCJ.
Our next guest is Dr. Andrew Engelhardt, who is an assistant professor of political science here at Stony Brook University. He received his PhD in political science from Vanderbilt University, and his research in part investigates how individuals' attitudes about social groups, particularly racialized groups, develop and change, and when, why, and among whom they influence opinions. This research is part of a general interest in how liberal democracies like the US navigate growing diversity. His research has been published in top peer-reviewed journals in political science and has been covered in media outlets including the New York Times and NPR. Hello, Dr. Engelhardt. Welcome, and how are you doing today?
Doing great. Thank you for having me. How are you all doing?
We are doing well. Thank you for asking. Well, it's a pleasure to be talking with you today. We aimed for this special episode series to address not only the accessibility of the electoral process, but also just the vital inclusion of marginalized groups, particularly those in the disabled community. As this topic can be very broad, our team tried to focus more on specific key points that align with the particular discussion we would like to have today. In this specific episode, we're eager to hear insights from both a faculty and political perspective. So thank you for graciously agreeing to join us today. And I'll just hop right into the first question.
Sure.
What do you believe are some of the biggest challenges with election inclusivity?
So one of the things that we need to think about in terms of like inclusiveness in elections is it's a bit of a feature and a bug with the US system. There's no kind of like central organizing administration for elections in the United States. It's basically up to the states to decide how they run elections. So what that means is we basically have as many states and territories as like that many specific kind of like election administration procedures. We have some federal regulations through the Voting Rights Act in terms of, for instance, how to offer like language accommodations or how to offer accommodations for here specifically disabled individuals. But then what these accommodations look like is kind of up to states and localities. They can go above and beyond the federal requirements, but it's kind of up to states and even counties and cities to decide what those specific manifestations look like. For instance, I've voted in several different states, right? There's varieties across states in terms of whether or not you're using paper and pen ballots, whether or not you're using electronic ballots, where the heck the precincts even are. Are they in accessible locations? Do you have to worry about parking? What is transit like to get to these locations? And basically all of these decisions are left up to local election administrators. They're not doing anything necessarily nefarious at all. It's just their decisions of like, where are large enough places where we can get people in. So given this kind of like mishmash, this like hodgepodge, it just immediately sets up a potential accessibility barrier because in trying to make sure that anybody who wants to vote has the opportunity to vote and can vote, setting up those like literal just places where people can go and vote, or what procedures exist for getting a ballot to vote absentee, to go and vote in person early. Like all of this stuff is kind of like defined in part at the state and local level, which can lead to accessibility issues depending on where somebody lives.
Yeah, I definitely can see how disorganized or maybe confusing or how confusing it could be for people who are trying to vote, especially when like you said, it's really up to the state or local governments to like organize these accommodations for voting. And because of these like different rules in different districts or counties, it could also be confusing for people to find out what they actually need in terms of voting, especially for first-time voters. I can definitely see how like overwhelming a lot of this information could be for them and could cause confusion. Like, I think uniformity, like you said, is definitely a really big issue when it comes to voting. So my next question, jumping into that, is how can we spot legislation that works to disenfranchise a group's ability to vote?
So I want to think about kind of like a couple different things here. So we don't have a lot, like really the only groups that are specifically disenfranchised, right, are individuals that are in the carceral state, or depending on, so they're kind of like in prison, or depending on like where they are in terms of kind of like where they live, whether they are re-enfranchised upon leaving say the prison system or out in terms of parole. When we think about disenfranchisement, though, we also want to think about just like actual accessibility to voting, and thinking about how we can make sure that any sort of legislation is kind of like promoting access, right? So we have this like small d democratic kind of like normative idea that folks who want to vote ought to be able to vote if they want to. One of the places that we can keep track of these things, given that states are the actors in terms of creating rules and regulations, is there's a website that basically tracks legislation across states, the National Conference of State Legislatures. They have kind of like basically a tab that keeps track of voting rights legislation across states. So what they'll do is that any sort of state that has they'll have a website where you can track, for instance, the New York State legislature will have a website where they note kind of like what bills have been introduced, where they are in the committee process, if they're coming up for a vote. And the NCSL basically takes this and thinks across states and provides an immediate repository for interested individuals to kind of like know what's on the table. So it provides a nice way to kind of like think holistically across states. Where are potential opportunities for expanding access? Where are places where there might be introductions and new restrictions that might limit access? So while we have, again, this hodgepodge of election administration, there are organizations like the NCSL that provide kind of like a central organizing kind of location, place to acquire this information. Unfortunately, it still requires a little bit of legwork. There isn't necessarily an easy way to then identify, say, voting restrictions. There's no kind of like clear flag that says like this is going to cause potential problems for a specific group. It just says that there is a bill in progress that deals with voting rights, and it would be up to folks like us to go in and kind of consider the legislation, say, okay, what are the things being proposed, and how might this affect the ability for individuals to, say, like, vote in a timely manner? Does it affect like when they can vote? So some things might be easier to spot in terms of limits. Legislation might specifically say, for instance, that they're going to expand the number of early voting days from, say, like 2 weeks before election day to 4 weeks before election day. So that's an easy way to think about accessibility. Other things might be a little bit harder, right? They might have in writing notes on how precinct voting locations are decided, right? And then we don't necessarily have the on-the-ground information to know if the selection of these precinct locations is, for instance, going to be in a place that's accessible by, for instance, public transit, if that's necessary for individuals to get there, or accessible in terms of a place that for instance, like having just like doors and hallways that are wheelchair accessible, or being put in a position where there is enough space for or opportunities for someone to vote if they are if they need, say, a Braille ballot or something. That's not necessarily easier to spot in these sorts of pieces of legislation. So it takes a little bit of like on-the-ground knowledge to decipher what goes into these bills. But at the same time, we do have this, again, NCSL website, not in the National Conference of State Legislatures, that like provides at least a first cut for us.
Yeah, that's really insightful. I think, like you mentioned, a lot of the common like disenfranchisement or tactics to kind of deter people away from voting is very subtle. Like we don't really usually spot that immediately, and it does take a lot of, well, not a lot, but like some awareness and research into like legislation and to like really see it in like fine print. The barriers to voting and stuff like that. I think with that awareness, it's great that we are somewhat aware. We have a lot of resources that help us become aware of these things and inform us about the necessary and little like fine print things when it comes to barriers to voting. And with that awareness in mind, one of my other questions is, what is one of the most powerful tools that the government utilizes to exclude certain groups from participating in the electoral process?
So politicians can basically make voting costlier. So a standard political science explanation for why people turn out to vote is in part a balance of costs. If it takes too long for us to vote, if we have to forego employment, if we have childcare costs, if they're so we have kind of like literal costs, opportunity costs, other just like personal costs, right? Do I feel even comfortable showing up in a place with a bunch of other people, right? So that's going to be kind of like, we have these like psychic, cognitive, emotional barriers. We have like literal economic barriers. So any sort of like thing that makes voting costlier is going to like necessarily reduce turnout. In part because, right, not everybody is super interested in politics, right? No matter what we have, like even like one of the highest turnout elections that we've had with the kind of like secret ballots was like a couple years ago, and we still only have like about 2/3, not even 2/3 of the U.S. public who's eligible to vote actually show up to vote. And this is a presidential election, let alone thinking about kind of like down ballot races, city council, et cetera, stuff that might have even a more immediate impact on somebody's daily life. So one of the things that politicians can do is just increase the costs. They can, for instance, restrict when people can vote. For instance, saying that you can only vote on election day, so limiting early voting, or early voting providing additional opportunities for people to show up and cast a ballot, right? That allows them to think about, here are more opportunities. I might be able to coordinate childcare. I might be able to show up into a place where I have some time off from work, right? Early voting is one way to like restricting that opportunity is one way to increase costs, reduce turnout. Restricting or making harder the ability to vote absentee, vote by mail. Voting by mail is a way for people to kind of vote on their own time. They can vote in their own home, right? So that decreases any sort of pressure if you're like nervous or uncomfortable about interacting with other individuals in a precinct, right? So requirements that vary across states in terms of vote by mail. There's different. There's variation in terms of how easy it is to vote by mail. Some states are automatic in terms of whether like they'll grant vote by mail. Other states require like specific excuses. There is variation in terms of what's needed to submit a kind of like valid ballot. The more kind of like obstacles that go into submitting a valid ballot, the less likely it is that somebody might vote, or if they do vote, that their vote might be counted. For instance, North Carolina, where I most recently lived, for an absentee ballot, it required you to vote, complete your ballot, and then have two separate individuals sign to verify that you, the voter, like did that. It requires you to find those people. It requires you to find time. All these small things add up to kind of like making voting harder, voting costlier. One of the important things to note, though, is that I've mentioned vote by mail, I've mentioned early voting. is that these things don't really have partisan effects, in the sense that just by increasing the ability for people to vote by mail, just by increasing the ability for people to vote early, these aren't going to, there's no clear evidence really that these systematically advantage people who identify as Democrats or people who identify as Republicans. In other words, there's no clear evidence that if we, for instance, make voting just on the board easier, that Democrats will win more elections or that Republicans will win more elections, right? One of the things that politicians always have in the back of their mind when they think about these election rules, though, is, am I making it easier for my opponents to win? Right? Which leads them to be a little bit more circumspect about kind of like making voting easier. But again, the best evidence we have in political science is that these things just make more people turn out to vote. There's not an advantage for one party or the other. So then states that kind of like make it a little bit harder to vote in terms of like raising the costs, it's they're kind of like sort of doing things that are just keeping most people, like more people away from the polls, not kind of like systematically protecting or benefiting their political side.
That's great insight. I've definitely heard of cases in which the government has excluded specifically marginalized groups from voting. And a good example is how you mentioned costs, such as like employment, childcare, other personal costs that can push people away from voting. Also, taking out options like mail-in voting or early voting definitely has a huge impact on election results. It was also interesting to see how you mentioned North Carolina. And it's interesting to see how the voting requirements vary by state and how some states make it harder to push people away from the polls. So this leads me to my next question, which is, your research focuses on how certain marginalized groups develop and change, and how even tolerant individuals do not always embrace policy positions or movements advancing full inclusion. How might this apply to specifically disabled individuals?
Yeah, so it's interesting to think about and important to think about the status of disabled individuals in the United States. As a group, there are about a quarter of Americans. Depending on how one thinks about or defines disability, the CDC effectively estimates that 1 in 4 Americans have some sort of disability, which puts them as a group, puts disabled individuals as a group on par with Hispanic Americans. So if we pay a lot of attention to race and ethnicity or kind of like religious minorities, disabled individuals, disabled Americans are actually a larger group, one to pay attention to. Disabled individuals too, in some of my work, right, draws on insights from social psychology and applies it to politics. One of the interesting factors for disabled individuals is that they're viewed positively by folks, like warmly, affectionately, but also viewed as less capable, less competent. So there's this like two-dimensional perspective, warmth versus coolness, like a favorability perspective, and then competence versus like basically how much control or action can they have. Reactions then in this social psychological literature is basically see like disabled individuals on par with older folks, right? You view them positively, but can lead to a situation of kind of like benign neglect. In the sense that like there's no kind of like positive action to address kind of concerns or issues. Rather, you let them kind of like keep doing what they're doing. And this is a problem where we don't necessarily then pay strict attention to the needs or concerns of this group, right? So it's not that disabled individuals face necessarily like systematic, consistent, outright prejudice. They're more likely to experience like kind of like individual patterns of discrimination, potentially in their day-to-day lives based on like omission, not necessarily commission. But what the challenge then is that if we think about, if we go at, say like voting rights, voting accessibility, right? One of the things that we have to always keep in mind is keeping the ability to vote accessible for everyone. And a lot of our attention in terms of voting is focused on race and ethnicity, which is important. It's race and racial background is a central dividing line in American politics. But disabled individuals are also covered under our focal pieces of legislation governing the conduct of elections nationally. So the Voting Rights Act, for instance, in the 1980s, one of its reauthorizations basically included individuals with disabilities under its purview, requiring states and localities to make sure that people with disabilities have like accessible ballots, have a way to vote. But again, to think about like the status of disabled individuals, right? This Voting Rights Act reauthorization came in part from kind of like activism around kind of like raising the status of disabled Americans, people with disabilities in the 1980s. We haven't really had that sort of activism again recently. So we have a quarter of the US population with some sort of disability that is basically waiting for folks to pay attention to them. There is consistent activism around improving like accessibility options, improving services for disabled individuals. And it's this like, and we need these pushes to get politicians to act. But if we think about rank ordering the concerns that some people might have, let's say, like these like tolerant individuals that you mentioned that I study, they might be focused on other marginalized groups. So in terms of the like amount of like the rank order concerns, just given the way that American politics is structured right now, they might put the concerns of people of color, religious minorities, they might have concerns about say reproduction, reproductive rights today. So like they have these other concerns that they have. And when you think about dividing up political attention, political time, they're putting these groups' concerns ahead of potentially the concerns of disabled individuals. So you can't address everything. You have to make trade-offs. And just given the nature of politics, it's like there's just like larger organized groups around these other issues than potentially disabled Americans, despite their prevalence.
Yeah, that's really interesting insight like into the complexities of inclusion and tolerance when it comes to like different groups. And I definitely do think that the disabled community specifically is overshadowed, like you mentioned, in comparison to other groups, which does like inclusion for them brings to mind the challenges faced by disabled individuals in our country when it comes to advocacy. Speaking of which, what do you think about the current state of activism and awareness of voter accessibility when it comes to fostering inclusion?
So we have at least the start of the Biden administration in terms of thinking about voter accessibility and access. Right. So the Voting Rights Act is up for reauthorization. It was last reauthorized in 2006, if I remember correctly. And we have these reauthorization periods because it updates existing legislation. So the Voting Rights Act is on the books. It's just that there's periods of concern about expanding access or kind of like investigating, rethinking, like, are the current statutes important for our present political moment? This bill didn't go anywhere. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act, as the Democratic Party called it, was meant to think about kind of like under what conditions can states redraw boundaries in terms of like gerrymandering, what opportunities do citizens have to basically bring lawsuits toward local and state election administrators in terms of voting rights options, like accessibility again. Didn't go anywhere. Why? Well, as I mentioned earlier, like voting rights has in part become seen as a partisan political issue, right? I mentioned that politicians are concerned with maybe making it easier for people to vote if the ease of access is going to advantage their political opponents, right? Elections in the United States today are pretty competitive. They're close. Changeover in Congress and the House and the Senate, for instance, is pretty tight. It's not like one party dominates either of these, like past periods of U.S. political history. So this makes like accessibility, makes kind of like just broadly promoting access to voters contentious and difficult. And given the need to basically find at least some opposing party votes to get stuff passed, basically makes it for voting rights is not a national level intervention. So it's basically up to states to take federal statute, take the federal minimums, and go beyond those if they want to. So we see kind of like more accessibility in states that might have populations pushing for accessibility options, right? So I mentioned language earlier as a potential option. So the Voting Rights Act requires localities with certain shares of what they call language minorities to have ballots in their language once they reach a certain threshold. States can go above and beyond that, which you could see if they have like specific like groups organizing to provide ballots in languages. So there is kind of like interest in accessibility among politicians, in part responsive to the work of organized groups, social movements, other activists, right? So this mass level organization, if folks are interested and care about election access, there are avenues for that. Politicians, at least on the Democratic side, based on existing evidence, appear open to these sorts of things. But then we hit kind of the politics, right? It's not necessarily everybody's on board with the kind of like policy implementation that's on, at least that has been proposed to improve access. Again, in part out of a fear or concern with changes in access affecting the balance of political power. But as I mentioned earlier too, most of the things that seem to make it easier for people to vote, that decrease the costs, there's no real clear evidence that those systematically advantage one political party or another. These things are published in peer-reviewed social science journals, so the evidence, at least from my read, seems credible. But then what politician is sitting down and reading academic research? Not entirely sure. And then we also have to take a step back and think about too, even if they knew the facts, would they necessarily still be incentivized to kind of like make voting more accessible for them or not? It's harder to say. So there is this interest and motivation with accessibility, but it seems asymmetric across the political parties. And then with the consequence, given that we are in a kind of closely divided, contentious political system, that stuff's not going to go anywhere in Congress, at least.
Yeah, I definitely agree that there will be challenges into actually implementing like change within like the leaders of each state. But I do think it is like one of the first steps that we should take in order to establish inclusivity, as their influence is highly important. But with that, I'd like to ask, like, how effective are their efforts?
Yeah, so if we think about just like groups that are interested in promoting accessibility and inclusivity, right? So we can think about them as being potentially effective in terms of getting politicians' attention, right? As I mentioned, right? So we have national level Democrats interested in pushing regulations to basically promote voting rights, in their view, voting rights access for given the design of the Voting Rights Act and the specific provisions, these would be for people of color, but like it suggests that they're open to and motivated by accessibility issues broadly, right? So it suggests that interested individuals can get a hearing, at least in terms of national level politics. But if we want to think about effectiveness in terms of groups being able to change policy, harder to say. But it's not that the groups themselves are necessarily ineffective. It's that like groups can only encourage politicians to take action. The groups do not have kind of like voting power over what goes to like how things go through committee, what things look like once they get to the floor for a vote. And again, this is at the national level. Folks interested in terms of like accessibility issues might find kind of like greater influence in like at the state and local level, right? Just because they might be able to point to kind of like local specific concerns that more clearly cut across partisan lines, that find a hearing that is open to politicians, or even if we set aside politicians, just election administrators. Most of these folks are just kind of like professional civil servants, right? They're just interested in like fairly running elections, right? So individuals that want to highlight accessibility concerns within the current legal frameworks could think about contacting their local election administrators. If you, for instance, go to vote and you notice, for instance, like potential accessibility issues, you could talk to election judges that are there and see if that, like during the day of, if they can make accommodations for folks. We can think about having conversations with the local election administrators as we move toward kind of like our party primaries this summer, moving toward the general election in the fall. Just kind of like right now, given that we have time, like acquiring information on it and then seeing kind of like what their plans are, what their goals are. Again, this is in existing legal frameworks. And then we can also take a step back too and say, like, okay, if there are bigger changes that need to happen, right, that if we think about election administration, not for instance in just Suffolk County, but like across the state of New York, that suggests maybe thinking about talking to our local assembly members, going to Albany and trying to contact individuals. Don't necessarily know if we need to literally go to Albany. We could try contacting them through email, but hey, like being physically there gets some attention that an email to an assembly person's office might not. So if folks are interested and active, I think that there is a payoff, right? Politicians will pay attention. Voting rights, kind of like election access, it's a kind of like fundamental concern for a democracy, right? If we, as members of a democracy, are meant to hold our politicians accountable, we ought to be able to have that opportunity decently accessible for us, easy for us to do. So organized movements can make a difference, at least in terms of getting politicians' attention, getting things on the political agenda. Whether or not that passes, though, that's again up to the actual political bargaining and political climate that we're in.
Yeah, I agree that sometimes we feel like marginalized groups, particularly, their voices may not be heard because of certain actions that aren't being taken immediately. But like you said, I think there is still hope that, you know, people in these positions of power do at least still have the ability to make a change, especially when there is more voices heard and we actually advocate for ourselves. In this case, when it comes to the amount of influence they have and their, although you did mention that when it comes to state by state, it can vary in terms of how much they can do. Mm-hmm. But that kind of brings me to my next question when it comes to the advice that you may want to give these marginalized groups, especially those with disabilities, to kind of encourage them to take part in this electoral process when it's faced with voter accessibility.
Mm-hmm. So participating in a process that does not seem to be responsive to you, I completely understand, can make one feel a little dispirited. Why do I want to do something where people aren't responsive to it? Why do I want to do something where it's hard, like where it takes more time than it ought to? One of the ways to think about this is just that, like, fundamentally, it's part of what being a citizen in a democracy is, to take action, right? And while that's not necessarily kind of like providing a clear payoff, right, it's one way that we can be a part of the process and make a difference. But if we take a step back too, we know that a lot of kind of like fundamental political change in the United States has been coupled with like citizen activism or even non-citizen activism, right? So we think about the like kind of like systematic pushes for civil rights, both in terms of civil rights for Black Americans, but also just more generally than people of color. Take a step back and think about the push for women's suffrage in the 19th Amendment, right? During the Vietnam War, push among young people to lower the voting age from 21 to 18, right? So we have patterns, we have historical precedent for folks that are either unable to vote or like literally or effectively based on policy implementation, right? So it kind of like highlights that things can change. But it also highlights that things change very slowly. So it's this mix, right? So you need it. A lot of this requires persistence, perseverance, which is annoying when you feel that things aren't responsive. But at the same time too, it's like we have like an optimistic perspective. I'm a glass half full person, even if I do study things that are basically glass half empty. Or it's and like a lot of what I study is like there is optimism and hope. If we want to make a change, we can change things. It just requires a little bit of work. One of the things too to think about is that there are multiple avenues for trying to participate politically and be engaged, right? It's not just voting, right? As I mentioned, you can contact your representatives. You can try and organize folks that are in your same community, to find individuals that are outside of the community but sympathetic, right? To get together, to work together, to organize. Maybe it's as simple as just raising concerns about local accessibility issues, right? Because for most of us, we have only 24 hours in the day. A good chunk of that is eating and sleeping. And then for folks in our position, right, for students, right, studying, for folks working, taking care of our families, which like very quickly cuts down the amount of time we have to pay attention to anything else. And there's a lot of other things to pay attention to. So one of the other ways that folks that are interested in addressing these concerns can be influential, even if they are themselves kind of like facing barriers in the process, is just to highlight the challenges they face for other people, right? So it's these sorts of like consciousness raising ideas that get people that like aren't challenged day to day with, say, like accessibility issues with voting, that then kind of like realize like, hey, like this is a problem I need to care about, and then it starts building a coalition that can move toward change.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that there does need to be a certain amount of persistence when it comes to trying to make a change, because I think oftentimes even if we voice our concerns and opinions and what we would like to change, if we don't see immediate results from it, we often can be like discouraged and then feel like our voices are not being heard. And even if we advocate for ourselves or try and raise awareness, it's not making any like physical visual change. But I definitely think that, like you said, there needs to be persistence, as we've seen in history where, groups that have been marginalized and just disenfranchised and just barred from, their rights, they have taken that time and necessary steps and have been consistent in trying to be heard and trying to make a difference. Again, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join us and provide your view on this topic. It's been a pleasure to be able to kind of hear a different perspective on this topic, and especially someone with, your knowledge and expertise. And yeah, our team just wants to thank you just overall, because I think we've all learned a lot just like from hearing your own specific perspective. I think we don't often hear like more of like a political perspective, especially with like the amount of information you've given us today.
Yeah, happy to be here. So thank you again for this opportunity.
Of course. Well, we hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and thank you again.
Thank you. You too.
Our next guest is an individual who brings firsthand experience and insight into the challenges faced by the disabled community. We wanted to have a conversation with them about the importance of discussing voter accessibility and disability advocacy. So today we will be having a discussion with Aafia Alladin, who identifies as a neurodivergent Muslim woman and is currently in her first year at the Columbia School of Social Work. She's passionate about exploring and researching interventions that can empower neurodivergent youth and help them advocate for themselves, as well as immersing herself in various opportunities that promote disability justice.
Oh, hi, it's nice to meet all of you. Yes, my name's Aafia, and you pretty much summed up like my introduction. I appreciate it. I also hope to at some point pursue a PhD and become more involved with like research and clinical experiences geared towards guiding neurodivergent youth and also youth with disabilities and promote disability justice.
Great. Well, it's a pleasure having you here with us today. So I'm just going to dive right into the questions. So what do you feel are some difficulties or challenges that individuals voting with a disability might face when it comes to participating in Election Day?
Yeah, I think it's important to have these conversations. And I would say that I noticed that like some sites they may not have like elevators or like ramps for wheelchair users or individuals who prefer to like use like the elevator of like what for to help them when getting to the site. So not all buildings might have like those facilities available. And perhaps like I guess for me personally when I voted, thankfully like the sites that I've been to have been quite accessible, but there might be other sites that don't have the same resources or facilities that can make it difficult. Or maybe transportation to and from the sites can also be a challenge. Especially if like not all like the transportation has like enough space for like a wheelchair user. This can pose a challenge also and limit and restrict how many can like go out and vote on election day.
It's definitely understandable how accessibility would be a challenge, and I think a lot of people don't realize how difficult voting can be for individuals with disabilities. So, with that, I want to ask, like, have you been personally impacted by some voter accessibility laws that have been passed over the years?
Um, I would say like thankfully for me, like voting has been pretty accessible based on like my location. However, there can be sites where it can be difficult for others. And even at the site I was at, like my grandmother, she has like dementia, so like for her, like it took some time for her to fill out the paperwork, and the the staff they kind of like didn't really help as much. They kind of expected like me or like my dad or my mom to help her out. Like they weren't really as supportive and like helping my grandmother through the like to write like the paperwork when it comes to like voting because she applied for absentee ballot even though she meant to like she wanted to vote in person. In that process they just like kind of like expected my grandmother to do most of the work and that made it difficult. I remember she felt like overwhelmed and stressed. I was able to help her out, but even for me, like my attention span is not this at times can like go in and out. So even I lost focus and got a bit confused when filling out the paperwork. And like the font and like the paperwork wasn't really easy to read it. So like that also can make it inaccessible to some extent. So yeah, that was like my recent experience during the special election, actually. Like the special election that was taking place on Ireland. So I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, those challenges are definitely like faced by a lot of like individuals in the disabled community, and I know that there have been efforts over the years of making voting more accessible through specific laws from the Voter Rights Act that essentially sparked the conversation of change for marginalized voters to the Americans with Disability Acts and the Have America Vote Act that prohibits discrimination of individuals with disabilities in all areas of public participation, and it aims to ensure full equal opportunity. Unfortunately, sometimes that's not enough because it has shown that roughly 1/6 of disabled voters required assistance and or had trouble casting a ballot last year. So with that being said, do you think voter accessibility has gotten more accessible or more limited?
Based on like my experiences, it's been like about the same. However, it's hard to tell like outside of like where my location whether voting sites are more accessible or not. I do notice that based on my previous experience, there wasn't too many staff to like help like assist like voters. So I wonder that also plays a role. Like if there's not enough staff to help, maybe they're less likely to accommodate um, like voters with disabilities due to like the lack of staff or like maybe knowledge of how to take care of these voters and recognize like their needs and acknowledge like their experiences and I guess I think that also plays a role to some extent because when I went, there wasn't too many staff, and that's probably why my grandmother felt like left out, kind of, and I had to like help her at the end because there weren't too many staff who were willing to like help out.
That's very insightful. I know I've definitely heard that it varies state to state as well, and a lot of limiting accessibility methods have been in place too recently, from what I've heard, like methods like curbside voting, third-party ballot returns, and being able to help a disabled voter vote as well has been limited to like certain people that are allowed to help as well, which goes back to your struggle with your grandmother about how she was also struggling and none of the poll workers were helping. So I think that's also like a very, very big issue that is concerning. And with the limiting accessibility or the struggle to find people to help people, vote who are disabled, my question is, do you think there's enough awareness or traction to the activism and or urgency for voter accessibility in politics?
Sadly, I don't think there's enough at the moment. I think that's why we need to push for more emphasis on and like promote a movement that can push for accessibility among voters and disability rights in general, I would say. So I believe there's more that needs to be done. And this is actually a very interesting topic too, because I don't, even in my disability studies classes, I don't really have these conversations as much. And I think these are very important because voting is like our essential right as citizens. So like it's important to keep that in mind and make sure that we can have our rights like guaranteed. And I think this is an important conversation to have. Like, and more I think needs to be done that extends beyond just having conversations, like taking action. Like as an aspiring social worker, I feel it's my responsibility to not only acknowledge the disparities among voters with disabilities, but also like take steps towards promoting like justice so that they can have access to like vote and that that polling sites can like accommodate for their needs and that they feel and that disabled voters with disabilities feel like empowered.
I agree. Awareness is an extremely important tool in highlighting how important voter accessibility is, and it's a good tool to also get the message across to a bigger audience. We've definitely seen examples of how awareness can shine light on important issues going on today, with like across multiple different movements. Which leads me to our next question, which is, what is the first change you want to see regarding voter accessibility for those with disabilities?
I guess it would be like maybe like the staff like we're willing to like help out like those with disabilities if needed be. If you have any additional questions, just offering that support ahead of time, or like that option to like reach out for support just so they feel acknowledged. And it's not to like pressure the voters to share anything regarding disability since it can be personal, but like just mentioning that we have to accommodate, and if you need any additional have any questions or want any accommodations, just let us know. Like just offering that like as an option, and like I think as mentioned before, like having more ramps and like the curbside voting can help, and perhaps like maybe trainings for like polling staff to just be mindful of like how to like support voters with disabilities and make sure that the voice is being heard and what and how and like the trainings can also align with like disability rights in general so that they can understand the scope, not just that applies to voting specific, but also in general.
Yeah, I definitely do think some accommodations are definitely not universal and should be more flexible to like more individualistic needs. There are definitely barriers that comes with this territory that is often overlooked, which is obviously tragic. It's also why I would like to ask you personally, what advice would you give to those with disabilities who may be nervous in engaging in the voting process?
That's a good question. I guess if I had to give advice, maybe I recommend like looking to like the resources ahead of time and seeing what options they have to vote. And maybe figure out which like voting option is the most successful for them at the moment. Either not all the options are not successful. Find like which is more like easier for them. Like for example, would going in person be easier or an absentee ballot? So maybe listen out the pros and cons for each option, and then if let's say like the visual disabilities go in person, they can like maybe ask if their accommodations can be met, and if not, maybe they can give feedback or like write like a complaint or like suggestion to like add these accommodations so that they feel heard. So those are the steps that I suggest.
Yeah, I definitely think it's very helpful to understand the accommodations that you are allowed if you are an individual who is voting with a disability. I know voting can be very intimidating when you're doing it the first time around too, because you don't know what to expect and it's all new and it's your first time. And I think it's great to know, like you said, what works best for you, whether that's going in person or sending in an absentee ballot, applying for mail-in ballots. And it's just overall, I think, really good to know that you have resources and just, yeah, like you said, research and be prepared as well. And to know what accommodations you think works best for you, like curbside voting or having like auto and visual ballot boxes. And yeah, I agree. Like overall, just having voters like be aware of these resources and steps for voting can be very helpful. So with the topic of awareness, I wanted to ask you, what are some things that we can do to help spread awareness about voter accessibility or to help take action?
I would say like acknowledging the lived experiences of individuals, including like those with disabilities, could be a good start. And I guess in order to spread awareness, it's maybe bring up these conversations in like disability study classes or like clubs or even disability services and bring up these conversations like support groups or focus groups so that or at least spreading awareness within the circles and also on social media that could be helpful. And then maybe maybe having conversations with like the polling sites also on how they can make their sites more accessible or maybe signing petitions can also be helpful, and having like meetings, the community like organizing events or meetings to discuss on how they can make their polling sites more accessible, and having like voters with disabilities be like in the lead so that they can share their experiences and give their suggestions and lead the conversations on how like the sites can be more accessible and how these sites can accommodate for their needs and help them feel like and like strengthen their identities and make them feel heard. So those are some ways I think that we can like spread awareness.
Yeah, I completely agree that definitely the first step is acknowledgement and obviously just making it a discussion in order to even spread awareness. I think making sure that all voices are heard is obviously important as well. But I definitely do think the first step is even acknowledging it as a topic, as an issue. And I know you already discussed the advice you would give, but I also want to know if you have any, like, what would be the main takeaway you want others to have when listening to your story and just about voter accessibility in general?
Um, I would say like and then the main takeaway is to promote this like voter accessibility movement and tie it with like social with disability justice initiative, and we can strive to promote disability justice in all settings, including voting settings. As a Muslim with a disability, as a neurodivergent Muslim, I want to feel heard and empowered. And I'll do whatever it takes for me to feel heard. And even means becoming more involved with disability justice movements or joining like clubs or events that revolve around disability justice. I'm definitely like in, and I want to make sure that I can like connect with others who have similar values and goals to like also promote disability justice. So I'd say developing that passion to like that can drive you towards partaking in these opportunities and become immersing in like experiences that can strengthen like your one's identity and feel like both sense of belongingness and sense of community can be helpful when it comes to promoting awareness and having like a shared struggle. Recognizing the shared struggles can also be valuable for like when it comes to connecting with other members of the disability community.
Thank you so much for joining us and just inputting your own thoughts and opinions in this, as well as just sharing your story and your experiences. We absolutely loved having you. And I really do think that this discussion is going to help kind of spread more awareness on this topic. Again, often overlooked topic. I don't think a lot of people even think about this when it comes to voting. And thank you so much for joining us. All right, so before we break for today, I just want to thank our guest speakers for coming and for sharing their thoughts on the importance of voter accessibility and disability advocacy. We also want to thank our viewers for tuning in and hope that you enjoyed this episode. If you have any further questions, you can always DM us on Instagram at Civic Justice SBU, and make sure you follow us in order to be updated with future episodes and events here at the Center for Civic Justice. Thank you so much, and we hope you have a wonderful day.